Okay. Something similar to what we did last week, but this time doing an Old Testament passage. Not just an Old Testament passage, but also an Old Testament narrative, because it's obviously that's quite a bit different to working on a passage like we had last week, which was kind of, you could say, propositional statements with a logical argument, because Paul is trying to make a point in what he's saying in Ephesians 2, to a narrative, you know, the telling of a story, because it's quite a different style of literature. And I guess the focus of a narrative passage is more on the drama than the doctrine. I don't know, you may have heard of have you heard of the 4 Ds? There's drama, doctrine, doxology, and discipleship. So in a way you could say that the way that God works, or God's revelation, begins with drama. So it begins with the acts that God does in history. And it's from experiencing God at work in the world and in our lives, and in Israel's lives, that Israel understood the doctrine. So because God acts righteously in his relationship with Israel, they say, well, we believe in the doctrine of God's righteousness. Not just because he's told us I am righteous, but because we've seen him working righteously in the way that he deals with his people. So we have the drama of God at work. Out of that flows the doctrine, the statements that we say about the truth of who God is and what he does and so on. Our response to that is doxology, giving him glory, responding in praise and worship and adoration. And then out of that worship then flows discipleship, where we hear his commands and we live in a way that glorifies him. Last week's passage was a passage that focused on, in a way, the doctrine, but it also reflected a bit on the drama, didn't it? Because it was still reflecting on something that God has done in history, but it was making those propositional statements about truth in light of what God has done. Whereas a narrative may not actually tell you the doctrine. It may be something that you have to glean from understanding the story and the drama of the story. So we'll be using some of the same tools we used last week, but also a couple of new tools from our toolbox. And the passage we're going to look at is, we looked at Jonah a couple of weeks ago, or just the first few verses, but we're going to look at nearly the whole of Jonah chapter 1, because that's obviously an extension of that story of Jonah, the first part of the story of Jonah. So as we did last week, I'll ask someone, if someone's willing to read it out aloud for us so we can hear God's word. Someone want to do that?
Okay.
Thanks, Peter.
Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me." But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each one cried out to his God. And they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. So the captain came and said to him, "What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish." And they said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us." So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, "Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation? And where do you come from? What is your country? And of what people are you?" And he said to them, "I'm a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Then the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, "What is this that you have done?" For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them. Then they said to him, "What shall we do to you, that the sea may quiet down for us?" For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. He said to them, "Pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you, for I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you." Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. Therefore they called out to the Lord, "O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you." So they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Now, if you were reading that in your Bible, you might say, hang on, you left a verse off. Because as an example of how chapter and verse numbers were added later and aren't always right, there is actually one more verse officially in chapter 1 of Jonah, but in reality it fits with chapter 2, the next part of the story. So that's why there's value in here. I've got rid of verse, chapter numbers and headings that are in the Bible, just so we're not influenced by those things. So, first impressions. Words, phrases and ideas that immediately stand out to you. Just give us a few.
We can see Lord in there lots of times.
The Lord, yeah.
Partly because it's in capitals, but...
So it's easy to spot, isn't it, the capitals. And remember, when you see Lord in capitals, that is, in the Hebrew, that's Yahweh, the Lord's personal name. If it's Lord in lowercase, L-O-R-D in lowercase, that's a different word in Hebrew which means literally Lord, but Lord in capitals is the Lord's name. Yep. Anything else?
I just mainly think of when he goes down into the ship and goes sound asleep and is not disturbed by anything.
Yeah.
I immediately think of Jesus. It's just what I in the boat.
And there's a few stories, isn't there, of the disciples in a storm, and then in one of them, Jesus is asleep in the boat.
Yes.
And he calms the storm. There's another one where he's there in the boat and he's not there, and he walks on the water. Yep. And when he gets into the boat, the storm stops. So Jonah has to be thrown out of the boat for the storm to stop. Jesus gets in. Yeah. So there's a lot of parallels there. Yeah.
And I suppose one of the things about Jonah is that it's the thing in the Old Testament that looks the most like New Testament evangelism. The idea of going and taking God's message to people in other countries that's mostly the trip to Nineveh. It's like he's sent to go somewhere with God's message. He goes the other way in disobedience to God, but he still ends up. He's like he's the most successful New Testament style missionary in the whole Old Testament, even when he's not trying to. When he's trying to do the wrong thing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Now all of that is good, right? Except, and it's good that we know our Bibles enough to make those connections. But for the sake of this exercise, we have to try and avoid, initially, we want to make those connections down the track, but at this stage, we're trying not to bring in anything from outside the text necessarily. We're wanting to say, what does this passage say in and of itself?
I'm intrigued why Jonah said, you need to throw me into the water. Because he said, look, I'll jump into the water for you.
Yeah, he could have just jumped in himself, couldn't he?
Yeah, he could.
That's
but
right, yeah.
Involved,
Maybe he wasn't brave enough to do it himself.
Maybe, yeah.
Maybe he had a tussle
Yeah.
with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, they wanted to. Yeah, they wanted to try other alternatives first.
I
Yeah,
reckon if
yeah.
I was in a plane with a parachute on my back for the first time to do a jump, I would have to get someone to push
Yes.
me
To push you out, yeah.
because I could not do it
Yeah.
on my own. I would be
Yeah.
so scared.
Yeah,
Yeah.
So perhaps that's what that's showing.
yeah. But another interesting thing is the way it says, the way it describes their conversation. It's as though the writer missed something and had to explain it later when it says that. But the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord because he had told them.
You told them, yeah.
So he kind of told the conversation not in order.
Yeah, so not strictly chronological,
Means
yeah.
anything.
Now you'll see, hopefully I've got there in your handouts on the the second page, there a little bit of extra historical and cultural background. Remember we did some of that work on the first few verses of Jonah a couple of weeks ago, but we didn't look at this whole passage. So there's a bit more there about some of the cultural background of the pagans and the way that they worship their gods, which could actually be helpful in dealing with, well, particularly the question of why does he say, throw me off, rather than I'll jump off. It could be that, because their understanding as pagans is if there's a storm, we need to appease the gods, and so we'll make a sacrifice. So it could be that they need to, in their thinking, and if Jonah is kind of capitulating to their thinking, saying it's not enough for me just to jump off, you actually need to give me as a sacrifice to this God who is causing the storm on the sea, to appease this God. And that could be part of that. Yeah. Now just take a moment just to jot down on your page, what would you initially say is the main point of this passage? So the first thing that jumps out to you, what would you say this passage is about? And bear in mind, it may change after we've done some work on it, but initially, your first impression. I'll just give you 30 seconds to jot something down. Don't try and analyse it too much. Just think, what is the big main idea that seemed to jump out to you? Okay, all right, let's start unpacking our toolbox. And as I said, some of the tools will be the same as last week. There'll be a couple of different tools because of the different type of passage it is. So, first thing is underline words or phrases that will need further explanation or definition. So as I said last week, this isn't necessarily words that you think we need to know the historical, cultural background to it, but more, I need to know what that word or phrase actually means if I'm going to understand what's happening in that part of the story. So this is where you may use a tool, whether it's in a book or online tool, where you look up and find out what the original Hebrew word is for that and what that word means, so I can understand how it fits into the logic of the story. Another way you can do that is get a couple of different English translations and see how the different translations translate that particular word. And you might find they all use exactly the same word, which tells you, okay, that Hebrew word has quite a direct correspondence between Hebrew and this English word, because all the translators of the different versions use it. Or you might find the different translations all use slightly different words, which are maybe synonymous or have nuances of the same meaning, and that'll give you a fuller idea of what that word actually means. What are some words you've underlined?
Well, I was a little bit thrown by the phrase, "What do you mean, you sleeper?"
Yep.
When they find him in the hold of sleep.
Yep.
And I guess the only way that I would immediately understand that is if it had said, "What do you mean by sleeping?" Like, for what reason are you sleeping in the middle of this storm? What are you running away from? Or please explain yourself. But what do you mean, you sleeper?
What do you mean, you sleeper?
He's asleep. So how can they ask him what he means?
What do you mean? Yeah.
And then it's like, well, they want him to explain something, but I don't know exactly what that word means in this context. So what is the original word, perhaps? It's not critical, because I don't think it's all that important, because obviously they're just wanting him to explain something, but it'd be nice to know exactly what they were asking him.
Yeah, and that's the case where flipping over to a different translation can help to see how is it.
He's got the captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God."
Yeah, how can you sleep? Yeah. So the ESV, which is this version here, is a more literal. So obviously, in the Hebrew, sleeper there is a noun. It's it literally means, what do you mean, you sleeper? But the NIV translators have understood that to be, what do you mean by sleeping? How can you sleep? Yeah. Any other words you've underlined?
I got a question. So then the crew were afraid and each cried out to his God, to Jonah's God?
No, to their God.
So they only have one God. So
Each means each to his. So
They believe in different
person
gods.
one to his, person two to his. So each means like for each person.
so
Whatever God they believed in, they prayed to them.
Yeah.
So each person may have a different God.
Yes.
So that's why I'm wondering why not their gods, but his.
So the crew are not necessarily, they could be different groups and have different,
Yeah.
And also they may believe in more than one God, or there may be more than one God in that culture. God that a particular family has.
So Joppa is in Israel, isn't it?
Yeah, Joppa's on the coast, just near. It's the closest port to Jerusalem.
But the crew could have been from any other people.
Yeah. Well, presumably it's a ship from Tarshish that has come over from Tarshish to bring goods.
Spain, isn't it?
Yeah, somewhere in Spain. Yeah.
Who knows what-
So here's words that I underlined, and as I said, the words that you underline it'll be different for different people, because depending on how much you know about words in the Bible, you might say, well, I already understand that word, but there may be another word that you think I need to understand a bit more. So I thought, okay, I need to look into more what it means, that phrase, from the presence of the Lord. That may be a bit of a cultural background thing too. Jonah's understanding of how can I flee from the presence of the Lord? What did that mean? I underlined, where do you come from? What is your country, and of what people are you? Just because I thought, well, if someone asked me that, I would feel like they're asking me the same question 3 times. To me, that feels like the same thing. Where I come from, what is my country? Isn't that the same? But obviously for them, there was a significance in those two questions. They mean something slightly different. So I'd want to look into, like the word country and people, and understand what are they trying to, what are the 3 or 4, what is your occupation? So what are the 4 things that they're wanting to work out about Jonah? And again, some of that will be brought out in that little box with some of the cultural historical background there. All right, next tool, use different coloured highlighters to identify repeated and related words, phrases or ideas. Okay, again, just for the sake of time, I'll start what I highlighted when I looked at this passage. The first one I noticed was arise, and Jonah rose, and then the captain, so the Lord says arise, go to Nineveh, Jonah rose, and the captain says arise. So this idea of getting up, and then at the end there, he says, pick me up. They picked him up. So this idea of upward motion. Now, actually, I looked at the Hebrew words behind that, and the first 3 are the same word in Hebrew, and the pick me up and picked up is actually a different word in the Hebrew, but it still has that idea of getting up, doesn't it? Whether it's an active getting up or a passive being picked up. Yeah. The second one I noticed was the idea of the presence of the Lord is there 3 times, and particularly fleeing from the presence of the Lord, in that sense. So it's highlighting, there's something you have to notice there about the fact he's trying to get away from the presence of the Lord. Then thirdly, downward motion is there too. Down to Joppa, into the ship, and then we're told he had gone down into the inner part of the ship. Which, see how Jonah is...
He keeps going the wrong way.
Yeah, he's been told, get up, get up, get up, but he keeps going down, down, down. And to preempt next week a bit, when we look at the bigger context, in the next chapter, he goes right down because he gets thrown into the sea, and in his prayer he talks about sinking to the depths of the mount, the roots of the mountains. So there's this downward motion happening, again counter to what he's been told to do. Instead of going up, he's going down. Then there's a lot of tempestuous. So a mighty tempest, more and more tempestuous, more and more tempestuous, and raging. I included that in that. Again, I looked up the Hebrew words, and it's all the same word except for the last one, raging. I thought, well, maybe it's just they've translated tempesting or something as raging, but no, it's actually a different word. But what occurred to me is, okay, it's kind of described as this natural phenomenon of the sea being tempestuous, but at the last time it's mentioned, it's almost like interpreting what's really going on, because that word raging is actually the word for anger and wrath. So it's like it's interpreting this tempest, which we've kind of already know because we know the Lord sent it, that it was actually an expression of God's anger and God's wrath in that sense. There's fear there. The mariners were afraid. Jonah says, I fear the Lord. Then they were exceedingly afraid. So there's a fear of the storm, but then there was a fearfulness in Jonah. Maybe he thinks, I'm not going to obey him, and so he's going to be angry at me, so I'll get away from his presence, and then he won't be able to get me with his anger. Little did he know.
Yeah. He's quite he knows that God's kind of the God of everywhere, and says
Yeah.
it at that point. But so, why did he think he could run away
Yeah.
from the presence of the Lord?
It's inconsistent.
Well, yeah. Well, maybe he had his theology right, but he actually had to learn it by experience before it became not just here's the doctrine
Yeah.
of God, but here is the reality of
And
God.
there's another reason in chapter 4 or 3 as to why he does that.
The last one I picked up was this word hurled. So the Lord hurled the great wind. Then you see the mariners hurling the cargo over. And then Jonah says, pick me up and hurl me into... So again, it's not just sending, it's this very aggressive, active throwing of something or someone.
And the word evil that came out.
Evil, yep. Yep. The evil of Nineveh. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. So again, I'll have to look into that and see again whether it's the same word in the Hebrew or not. But often evil is used not just of immoral actions of people, but it's a word that is often used to refer to catastrophes and calamities and harm that happens to people. Yeah. Okay. So see, just by doing that, we've started to get a fuller sense of what's going on in this story and what's happening a bit behind the scenes of what's being described. Okay, now we're going to do the activity again, which we did last week. We're going to look at the people in the passage and what actions are done by them and to them. So, who are the people? Who are the characters in this story? Who's the first one that appears in the story?
Yahweh.
Yes, the Lord. Okay, is there anything done to the Lord in the story? Say again?
He's disobeyed.
He's disobeyed. Okay, yep. Disobeyed by Jonah. Yep. Any other actions kind of that are directed towards him?
Well, later on, right at the end, he gets a sacrifice offered to him by the pagans.
Yes.
on the boat.
Yeah. So he's sacrificed to, and vows are made to him by the sailors. He's called upon by the sailors, and he's feared by Jonah. Well, at least Jonah confesses that he fears him, and feared by the sailors. What's done by the Lord in this passage?
He sends Jonah and then he sends the storm.
Yeah, so he calls Jonah, says, arise, go. He sends the wind, which causes the waves. Yeah. Anything else? He stops it. Yeah, it doesn't explicitly say that, but it's implied, isn't it? If he sent the storm, then when the storm stopped, it means that he stopped the storm. Yeah, okay. All right, who's the next character that appears on the scene? Jonah himself. All right. What's done to Jonah? Called by God to go to Nineveh. He's hurled overboard into the sea. Anything else that's done to him?
He's woken up not by the storm, but by the crew who are afraid
Yeah,
of the storm.
yeah. He's woken by the captain. Yeah, yep. What does Jonah do? So he flees from the Lord's presence.
But then when asked, he's happy to say that he belongs to God.
Yeah. So he makes a confession, doesn't he, of who he is and who the Lord is. Add other thing like he boards the ship for Tarshish. He gets onto the ship and he sleeps.
says-
And the third character, which is actually kind of a group in a sense, is, we could say, the crew of the ship, kind of lumping together the captain and all of the sailors. What's done to them?
Well, they were going about their business,
Yeah.
but then an errant prophet of the Lord comes aboard and they end up in a storm.
Yeah.
That was enough that they were scared, even though they were
Yeah,
sailors.
yeah. So they're just traders, sailors on a ship, and suddenly, yeah, they're subjected to this storm. And it sounds like, I mean, these are sailors. The fact they were exceedingly afraid probably indicates this storm is maybe like one they've never experienced before. Yeah. What do they do? We're going to do this, and I've got steps. I guess you could imagine maybe that you're writing a screenplay, and you think, okay, there's all these scenes. Story of Jonah chapter 1. So Jonah gets called to go to Nineveh. Then what happens next? Jonah goes to, he arises to flee to Tarshish. Then he goes to Joppa. See, we're looking at the very small details. He finds a ship there. We're told he then pays the fare, and then he gets on the ship. Okay. Now, he finds a ship, he pays the fare. We want to notice them because it may be that as we work on the passage, we realise there may be a significance in the fact that the writer says he paid the fare. I mean, why would he say it? Or it could just be he's telling a story, and so he gives those little details and it helps the flow of the story. So noticing those little bits helps us distinguish between those things that are significant to take notice of and those things that are just part of the narrative. He tells the crew he's running from port. So there's one of those things that in the passage itself isn't quite chronological. We find out later he'd already told them. So he must have done that early on. Sleep. What he was doing before he went to sleep. The storm threatens to sink the ship. The crew cry to their gods. The crew try to lighten the ship. Now see how I'm just looking at these in a very horizontal way. I'm just saying if you're an observer watching this without any kind of theological background, you're just describing the events happening as they happen. The captain wakes him and tells him God, and the crew out by casting lots that Jonah is responsible for the storm. And so they interrogate him those 4 questions about who he is, his identity. Jonah answers and tells them that he is a Hebrew. I forgot to mention when we're underlining, I'd underline this word Hebrew. So I thought, okay, why does Jonah call himself not an Israelite? So that's maybe something worth looking into. Why is he described as a Hebrew instead of by maybe his nationality or his tribe or the town he comes from? They then become exceedingly afraid, not just of the storm, but in light of what he has said. Because the crew asked Jonah what they should do. Jonah answers, "Throw me into the sea." The crew try in vain to row to safety. Doesn't work. And then the crew call out to Yahweh, "We're not accountable for this man's death." The crew throw Jonah overboard. The storm stops and the crew sacrifice and make vows to the Lord. Okay, so now maybe if you do that exercise, you might come up with something slightly different because you highlight different parts of the action, but it just gives us a chance to look at every little step and say, is it significant or not? But also to look at that and say, what does the text now tell us about what's actually going on, in a sense, behind the scenes? So Jonah arises to flee to Tarshish. We're told, he's called to go to Nineveh. He's called by Yahweh, by the Lord. He's fleeing to Tarshish to get away from the Yahweh's presence. He tells the crew he's running from the Lord. So that combined with the earlier bits might say that Jonah has this view of Yahweh, of the Lord, that somehow maybe he's limited to the land. And so to get away from his presence, that's why he's got onto the ship. But there's a theological thinking that Jonah is using in his rationale for running away from the Lord. A storm threatens to sink the ship, but we know that the storm is sent by Yahweh. So it's not just a natural phenomenon, it's Yahweh who's sent the storm. The captain wakes Jonah, tells him to call on his God. What does that tell us about the captain's thinking? The captain's maybe thinking that Yahweh or Jonah's God is just another God, so let's add to all the gods we're calling on because one extra God might help save the ship. The crew become exceedingly afraid. Why? Again, it's kind of implied, but it's not stated. Why are they exceedingly afraid in light of Jonah's answer, I fear the Lord, who is the God of both land and sea, and he's disobeyed. Yeah. They realised this God that Jonah's running from, he's actually chased Jonah. He's actually here. And he's not just the God who's able to do stuff on the land, but he's the kind of God who can throw the sea into turmoil. He's the God of the sea, not just the God of the land. The crew try in vain to row to safety, maybe because they're not convinced that either that Jonah's God is responsible for this storm or that Jonah's God is powerful enough to destroy them. They cry to Yahweh, we're not accountable for this man's death, so now they're acknowledging, okay, we have to acknowledge this God and we have to call out to him and hope that he will not hold us accountable for what we're about to do. The storm stops and it's stopped by Yahweh. The crew sacrifice and make vows to the Lord. Now what's that statement telling us, you think? The fact that this passage concludes, this section of the story concludes with these sailors making sacrifices and making vows to the Lord. Which shows us that they are now recognising Yahweh, he's more powerful than all of the other gods, because we sacrificed to our gods and called out to our gods and didn't work. Now we've made this sacrifice, thrown this guy overboard to this God Yahweh, and the storm stopped. So now we actually have to, whether they were thinking we'll get rid of those gods and now we'll worship Yahweh, or they may have been thinking, okay, we need to add Yahweh now to our collection of gods that we believe are in charge of the sea, so that next time we go out sailing, we'll make a sacrifice to Yahweh as well, so that he doesn't send another storm. So whether they were adding him to their collection of gods or whether they were getting rid of their gods and worshipping him as instead, we don't know, but we understand it's that contrast between Jonah, who's not obeying the Lord, and these pagan sailors who at least are recognising who the Lord is.
Well, the fact that they feared him exceedingly.
Yeah. They were fearing the storm exceedingly, weren't they? And now they're fearing the Lord exceedingly. Yeah. Now another tool. I'm just conscious of the time, so I'll try and move a bit quicker through this. Look at the dialogue between the characters in the story. So see what are the people saying about God. So the statements people make about the Lord, and are they speaking truly or are they speaking wrongly? Are they making true statements about God, or are they saying something about God that's false or untrue? And then also look at the conversations. How do people address each other? How do they ask and answer questions? So just as an example, they come to Jonah and they say, "Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country? And what people are you?" And he doesn't actually answer fully, does he? He doesn't give them all those details. All he says is, "I'm a Hebrew and I fear the Lord, Yahweh." In other words, this is who I am and this is who my God is. The other things don't actually really matter. All you need to know is Yahweh has sent this storm, and he's the one who needs to be addressed to deal with the problem. The other thing we need to do in a narrative passage is identify which parts of the passage are descriptive. And in a narrative, most of it will be descriptive. It's just telling us, here's what happens. Simply recounting or describing an event or a person or an action. And very often, the biblical narratives just tell us, here's what happened, and it doesn't give us an interpretation of it, or it doesn't tell us, it says this king did this. It doesn't always say, and it was wrong in the eyes of the Lord, or it was good. It just says this thing happened. And it's kind of up to us to use the context and other parts of Scripture to make our own assessment of whether this was right or wrong. But descriptive means it's in contrast to the prescriptive, which is a command or an instruction requiring the reader's obedience. And often we might get the two mixed up. Right? We read a narrative which is descriptive, and we might take that as, okay, this person did this, therefore I need to do the same. I heard someone recently tell the story of how Jehovah's Witnesses knocked on their door, and he said to them, "I'm a Christian, in fact I'm a pastor," and they said, "Oh, okay, do you go door to door?" And he said, "No, why?" And they said, "Well, because the Scripture tells us that we must go door to door, because it says in the book of Acts, or is it in the Gospels, that the apostles went from house to house. Therefore, we must go from house to house." See how they've made this mistake of taking a descriptive passage. If the Scriptures said, therefore, because the apostles went house to house, therefore all of Jesus' followers must also go house to house, well, that's prescriptive. So we need to make sure we make that distinction between simply describing an event, or is there something that tells the reader, therefore you must do this, or a command. Or I guess in the middle of that is what you could call exemplary, which we think means something that's really excellent. But exemplary kind of means an example to follow. So a person or an action that's presented in such a way that it's clear, here is a model for us to follow. Or by contrast, we shouldn't do what they're doing, because obviously what they're doing is wrong. So an example of that, I guess, would be when it talks about Abraham believing the Lord, having faith. And it's just, that's descriptive there in the narrative itself. But we understand that Abraham then, it becomes a model, an example for all people, because we see it referred to in the New Testament, where it's continually referring to Abraham's example of one who lived by faith. So even though the passage itself doesn't say, therefore you must also believe the Lord, it's presented as a model, as an example that anyone reading this story should follow his example of having faith in the Lord. To finish, review first impressions. Go back and see what you initially wrote as what you thought was the main point of the passage, and just reflecting on what we've done now on that passage, see whether you would write something different, or maybe it's enlarged on what jumped out to you initially as the main point of the passage.